Here's something that might surprise you. The person at the party who seemed effortlessly confident. The one who moved through the room like it cost them nothing, laughing easily, never at a loss for words. There's a reasonable chance they went home that night and replayed every single thing they said. That's the thing about social anxiety. It doesn't always look the way we expect. Most people assume it belongs to the obviously quiet ones, the people who visibly shrink at the edges of a room. And sometimes it does. But research tells us that social anxiety is one of the most quietly pervasive experiences in all of psychology, affecting somewhere between 7 and 13% of people in Western countries over a lifetime, making it the third most common mental disorder worldwide, sitting just behind depression and substance use disorders. In a room of 10 people right now, statistically, at least one of them is living inside this experience, possibly more. And the reason it stays so invisible, so underestimated, is that almost everyone with social anxiety has become extraordinarily skilled at one thing: hiding it. So let's turn the light on. Gently, slowly, the way you would in a room where someone's sleeping. There's no urgency here, just a quiet, curious exploration of what social anxiety actually is, where it lives in the brain and the body, where it comes from, and what the science, decades of it, says about finding your way through. Settle in, breathe. Let your weight sink where you're resting. We have time. The first thing worth getting clear is what we're actually talking about, because social anxiety is one of the most commonly misunderstood terms in all of mental health. It is not the same as shyness. Shyness is a personality trait, a temperamental preference for caution and reserve around unfamiliar people or situations. Many shy people live full, rich, socially connected lives. They might take a little longer to warm up. They might prefer a quiet dinner to a crowded party. But shyness, in itself, doesn't prevent people from living the life they want. Social anxiety disorder, which was still called social phobia until the DSM-5 was published in 2013, is something qualitatively different. According to the DSM-5, the diagnostic criteria require a marked and persistent fear of social or performance situations in which a person might be exposed to scrutiny by others. Not just mild nervousness, not just a preference for quieter spaces. A fear intense enough that the person either avoids the situation entirely or endures it with significant genuine distress. And crucially, the fear, the avoidance, the anticipatory dread must cause meaningful impairment in a person's social, occupational, or daily functioning. It must last at least 6 months. At its core, social anxiety centers on one very specific fear: the fear of being negatively evaluated. Not social situations in themselves, but what those situations might reveal. The terrifying possibility that if people look closely enough at you, they will see something inadequate, something embarrassing, something worthy of rejection or mockery. And here's the first thing in tonight's exploration that might genuinely surprise you. The DSM-5 notes that adults with social anxiety typically recognize, at some level, that their fear is disproportionate. They know, intellectually, that their terror of speaking up in a meeting is larger than the actual threat. The mind holds both truths simultaneously: the reasonable voice that says, "This is fine," and the ancient urgent alarm saying, "This is dangerous." And the alarm is almost always louder. What that tells us, and this matters, is that social anxiety is not a failure of logic. It's not something that can be reasoned away. It's happening somewhere deeper than thought, in systems the brain developed long before language. Which brings us to exactly that place. Here's where the story takes an unexpected turn. Because if you've ever wondered why social anxiety can feel so physically overwhelming, why the heart pounds, why the throat tightens, why every cell in the body seems to be screaming danger at a dinner party, The answer goes back much further than psychology. It goes back to survival. Deep inside the brain's temporal lobe sits a small, almond-shaped structure called the amygdala. Its job, refined over millions of years of evolution, is to detect threat and trigger a response before the conscious mind has any chance to weigh in. Speed is the whole point. A predator doesn't give you time to deliberate. The problem, and it is genuinely fascinating that this is a problem, is that the amygdala does not distinguish between a physical predator and the social equivalent of one. A contemptuous look, a room full of eyes turning toward you, a silence that falls a half second after you speak. To the amygdala, these can register as threat just as urgently as anything physically dangerous. Neuroimaging research has confirmed this directly. Studies using functional MRI, including work by Stephen Stein and colleagues published in 2006, found that when individuals with social anxiety disorder were shown photographs of faces expressing contempt or anger, their amygdala activation was significantly higher than in people without the condition. Even when those faces were shown so briefly that participants couldn't consciously report seeing them. The alarm fires before the thinking self arrives. The neuroscientist Joseph Ledoux described two neural pathways through which the amygdala processes threat. A fast, low-resolution route, he called it the low road, bypasses conscious thought almost entirely, triggering the body's stress response in milliseconds. A slower, more thoughtful route, the high road, travels through the prefrontal cortex, where the brain can deliberate, reevaluate, and modulate. In people with social anxiety, the low road appears to be especially reactive, and the high road's ability to quiet the alarm is, based on what the neuroimaging shows us, less effective than in people without the condition. What this could mean is that the very pathway designed to say, "Wait, it's okay," has a weaker signal. The stress hormone cortisol is part of this picture too. Research has found elevated cortisol levels in people with social anxiety during what are called anticipatory periods, meaning the body's stress response begins not when the threatening situation arrives, but in the hours before it. The body starts preparing for danger before danger is even present, which goes some way toward explaining why the dread of an upcoming event can feel as exhausting as the event itself. There's one more neural region worth mentioning: the insula. This area of the cortex is involved in interoception, the brain's monitoring of the body's internal states. Heightened insula activity, which has been observed in social anxiety research, appears to amplify awareness of physical sensations. The racing heart, the warmth in the face, the subtle tremor in the hands. These become louder, more noticeable, more significant than they might otherwise be. And as we'll see shortly, that amplification becomes the source of one of social anxiety's cruelest features. Understanding the brain helps explain how social anxiety sustains itself. But where does it come from in the first place? The answer isn't simple. And it's worth pausing here on something that might reconfigure the way you think about it entirely. Social anxiety is not caused by weakness of character. It is not caused by being too sensitive, or by having had a bad childhood necessarily. The science points to a genuinely complex interplay between genetics, temperament, and environment. Factors that are largely outside any individual's control. Genetics account for somewhere between 30 and 50% of the variance. In social anxiety, based on twin studies published throughout the 1990s and 2000s, that's a meaningful contribution. Not deterministic, but real. What the genes appear to influence most is something called behavioral inhibition, a temperamental quality identified and studied extensively by developmental psychologist Jerome Kagan at Harvard University. Behavioral inhibition describes a pattern observable in infants and young children, a tendency to become quiet, to withdraw, to show heightened physiological reactivity in the face of unfamiliar people or environments. Some children, from remarkably early in life, treat novelty as suspect. In his longitudinal research, Kagan found that children with high behavioral inhibition were significantly more likely to develop social anxiety later in adolescence and adulthood. And here is the twist embedded in that finding, because it's a meaningful one. Behavioral inhibition is not a flaw, it's a variation. In the right environment, with the right kind of support, many highly inhibited children grow into deeply perceptive, empathetic, socially skilled adults. The quality itself is not the problem. What matters enormously is what happens next, and that's where environment enters. Research by Susan Rapey at Macquarie University, who has published extensively on parenting and childhood anxiety, found that parenting characterized by overprotection and overcontrol significantly increases the risk of social anxiety in children who already have an inhibited temperament. When a child is repeatedly shielded from the ordinary manageable discomforts of social life, what they may learn, based on what we understand about anxiety development, is not that the world is safe, but that it must be dangerous. Otherwise, why would they need so much protection? The messages don't have to be explicit. A parent who expresses chronic worry about what others think, who responds to their child's social stumbles with alarm rather than calm confidence, may be transmitting the belief that social situations are something to be feared, without a single direct sentence to that effect. Peer experiences layer on top. A child who is laughed at during a school presentation, repeatedly excluded by a group, or publicly mocked for something they said may develop what psychologists call a conditioned fear response, an association between social situations and the threat of humiliation that can persist for decades, long after the original incident has faded from conscious memory. Stanley Rockman, in a 1977 paper that remains influential today, described 3 pathways through which fears are learned: through direct experience, through watching others experience fear, and through information, being told, repeatedly, that something is dangerous. All 3 pathways operate in the development of social anxiety. Most cases emerge during adolescence. The median age of onset for social anxiety disorder is around 13. When you consider what is happening neurologically and developmentally at that age, a prefrontal cortex still years away from full maturity, a brain exquisitely tuned to peer evaluation, identity under active construction, and social consequence feeling absolutely enormous, it begins to make a quiet kind of sense why this is when the pattern takes root so often and so deeply. Here is the part of social anxiety that is, in many ways, the most important to understand, because social anxiety doesn't just arrive and stay by accident. It maintains itself through a set of interlocking cognitive patterns that were identified and mapped with remarkable precision by British psychologists David Clarke and Adrian Wells in 1995. Their model, which has since become one of the most researched and clinically applied frameworks in anxiety psychology, describes a self-perpetuating cycle that activates the moment a person enters a feared social situation. It begins with the beliefs that person carries into the room. For someone with social anxiety, these beliefs tend to run something like, I will say something foolish. They will see I'm nervous. I lack whatever quality is needed to be acceptable here. These beliefs don't always announce themselves explicitly. They often operate as background assumptions, the quiet, persistent hum underneath the surface experience. Once activated, something counterintuitive happens. Rather than focusing outward, reading the room, tracking the conversation, attending to what's actually happening, the person's attention turns inward. Clarke and Wells called this self-focused attention, and it is, in a sense, the opposite of what ordinary social navigation requires. Instead of gathering information about the environment, the person is monitoring themselves, checking for evidence of failure, tracking physical sensations, constructing a mental image of how they must appear to everyone watching. And this is where the cruel element arrives. That mental image, what Clark and Wells described as an observer perspective, is constructed not from any real feedback, but from how the person feels. If they feel beet red, they picture themselves as visibly, undeniably beet red. If they feel like their voice is trembling, they hear a performance dissolving. Research has shown, fairly consistently, that when people with social anxiety watch video recordings of themselves in social situations, they are frequently surprised by how composed they appear, because the internal experience and the external reality are so deeply misaligned. Then there are safety behaviors, the things people do to try to manage the anxiety and prevent catastrophe. Avoiding eye contact, speaking very quietly, memorizing elaborate conversational scripts, gripping something to hide trembling hands. These feel protective. In the short term, they do reduce anxiety. But here's what makes them so insidious. Every time a safety behavior works, it teaches the person that the behavior, not their own capability, was what kept catastrophe at bay. The feared outcome never gets tested. The belief that the situation is dangerous never gets challenged. And so the next anticipated situation carries the same weight as the last one. Finally, there is what researchers call post-event processing, the ruminative review that happens after a social situation ends. Rather than moving on, the person replays the interaction in detail, searching for evidence of failure, re-experiencing the emotional discomfort of the encounter, updating their predictions about what the next one will bring. This review is almost never balanced. It attends to every stumble and ignores every success. And because it rehearses the feeling of shame, it consolidates the neural association between social situations and threat, making the amygdala's alarm even more likely to fire next time. What makes this model so powerful is that it explains something people with social anxiety often find baffling about their own experience: why the anxiety doesn't go away even when social situations usually go fine. The answer is that the cognitive system is designed in such a way that nothing can disconfirm the belief. Every tolerable outcome is attributed to safety behavior. Every difficult moment is taken as evidence. The loop is closed. Now we come to the part that, for many people with social anxiety, is the most distressing dimension of the whole experience. And there is a reveal buried inside it. When the amygdala fires its alarm in a social situation, the body responds in the way bodies are built to respond to threat. Heart rate increases, breathing quickens. Blood is redistributed toward large muscle groups and away from the face, hands, and digestive system. Sweat glands activate. The stress response is doing exactly what it evolved to do. But social anxiety adds another layer, because the body's visible responses, blushing, sweating, a voice that catches, hands that tremble, become, in themselves, the object of the fear. The person is no longer just afraid of being judged for what they say. They are afraid of being seen to be afraid. And that fear of the symptoms produces more symptoms, which produces more fear. This is what researchers call meta-anxiety, anxiety about anxiety. And it is one of the most reliable features of the disorder. Blushing deserves particular attention here, because research consistently identifies it as the most distressing physical symptom for people with social anxiety. Blushing is governed by the sympathetic nervous system, and it is entirely involuntary. It cannot be suppressed by willpower, which is part of what makes it so frightening. For someone who dreads being seen struggling, the blush feels like the body holding up a sign that reads, "This person is embarrassed right now, and here is the reveal." Multiple studies have found that people with social anxiety consistently and significantly overestimate how much they are blushing. Their physiological levels of flushing are often comparable to those of non-anxious individuals in the same situation. The perceived catastrophe and the measurable reality are miles apart. The same overestimation appears with sweating, voice tremor, and a racing heart. People with social anxiety inhabit a magnified internal experience that, from the outside, is often almost entirely invisible to others. When researchers have asked observers to rate the anxiety of socially anxious individuals during social tasks, the observers routinely detect far less than the participants believe they are displaying. This is not a comforting fact that dissolves the experience. The internal experience is real. The distress is real. But it does point towards something important about the nature of social anxiety. It is not a performance problem. It is largely a perception problem. And that means the site of change is not in becoming different, but in learning to perceive differently. Social anxiety does not arrive fully formed. It evolves. And the form it takes at different points in the lifespan reveals something about what the condition is actually responding to. In early childhood, the precursor most clearly linked to later social anxiety is behavioral inhibition, that temperamental caution we explored earlier. A closely related presentation is selective mutism, a condition now understood as a severe manifestation of social anxiety, in which a child speaks typically at home but becomes completely unable to speak in other contexts, most commonly school or in the presence of unfamiliar adults. The DSM-5 classifies it separately from social anxiety disorder, but recognizes their close relationship. For these children, the social world has, in some functional sense, been categorized as a place where speech, and therefore exposure, is not safe. Adolescence is the critical window. The median age of onset for social anxiety disorder hovers around 13, and this timing is not arbitrary. The adolescent brain is neurologically distinct from the adult brain in ways directly relevant to social anxiety. The prefrontal cortex, the region responsible for emotional regulation, impulse control, and the modulation of the amygdala's alarm system, is still in active development throughout the teenage years and into the mid-20s. Meanwhile, the brain's sensitivity to social reward and punishment is at a developmental peak during adolescence. The result is a period in which social judgment carries enormous emotional weight, and the neural tools for managing that weight are not yet fully available. For a young person already predisposed towards social fear, this period can be the moment the pattern solidifies. It's worth pausing here on Generation Z specifically, those born roughly between 1997 and 2012, because theirs is the first generation to have navigated adolescence almost entirely inside the architecture of social media. And the data suggest this has consequences. A widely cited 2020 study across 7 countries found that social anxiety among young people aged 16 to 29 may be substantially higher than earlier epidemiological estimates suggested, with more than 1 in 3 respondents meeting threshold criteria for social anxiety disorder based on self-report measures. Researchers have raised important questions about methodology. Self-report measures capture a broader population than structured clinical interviews, but the directional trend is worth taking seriously. What social media appears to do, based on what we understand about the mechanisms of social anxiety, is extend the reach of social evaluation beyond any physical space. The party ends, but the notifications don't. The post stays. The likes are countable. And for someone already sensitized to evidence of judgment, that quantified, always accessible record of social response could mean the low-level threat signal never fully goes quiet. In adulthood, social anxiety intersects with the concrete demands of professional and relational life. Job interviews, presentations, networking, first dates, social events with strangers. Each carries the potential for the cycle to activate. And avoidance, the primary coping mechanism, begins to quietly narrow the world. A career that doesn't fully develop because certain roles were avoided. Friendships that never deepened because the social vulnerability required for intimacy felt too high. These costs accumulate slowly, invisibly, over years. The mechanism through which social anxiety most durably harms a life is avoidance. And it's worth spending a moment here on why avoidance is so difficult to simply decide to stop. When a feared situation is avoided, the nervous system experiences relief. That relief is real, immediate, and reinforcing. It teaches the body, at a level beneath reasoning, that avoidance works. And because it works, in the sense that it reliably removes distress, the nervous system advocates for more of it. Over time, avoidance tends to generalize. What begins as avoiding a particular type of meeting might, across months and years, quietly expand to avoiding the office, declining the invitation, choosing the smaller life. Research on the occupational consequences of social anxiety has found meaningful effects on career trajectories. People with social anxiety are less likely to be employed in managerial or professional roles, tend to have lower earnings relative to educational attainment, and report higher rates of underemployment. There is often a painful gap between what a person knows they are capable of and what they have managed to pursue. Social anxiety disorder also carries high rates of comorbidity, meaning it frequently co-occurs with other conditions. Major depressive disorder is the most common, estimates suggests somewhere between 35 and 70% of individuals with social anxiety will experience significant depression at some point. The trajectory makes intuitive sense. Chronic avoidance means chronic isolation. Chronic isolation, and decades of loneliness research make this clear, carries serious costs: elevated cardiovascular risk, accelerated cognitive decline, compromised immune function. Human beings are not designed to live alone from the social world. Alcohol use disorder is another significant comorbidity, and the pattern is revealing. Longitudinal research shows that for many people, social anxiety precedes the development of problematic drinking by years. Alcohol, in the short term, reliably dulls amygdala reactivity, reduces self-focused attention, and quiets the alarm just enough to allow participation. It is entirely understandable. It simply comes at a cost that compounds over time, while the underlying pattern goes unchanged. And now, the part that matters most, and that the science treats with genuine optimism. The treatment with the strongest and most consistent evidence base for social anxiety disorder is cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT. The specific form of CBT developed for social anxiety draws directly on the Clark and Wells model, and it has been studied in rigorous, randomized controlled trials for over 3 decades. It has 2 core elements. The first is cognitive work, the careful, structured examination of the beliefs and predictions that fuel social anxiety. Not replacing negative thoughts with relentlessly positive ones, but learning to hold them with a little more flexibility. To ask, genuinely, what is the evidence? What actually happened the last time? What would I say to a friend who believed what I'm believing right now? The second, and often more transformative, element is exposure. The deliberate, gradual, supported process of entering feared situations without using safety behaviors. The goal of exposure is not to eliminate anxiety. It is to let anxiety rise and fall naturally, and to collect real-world evidence about what actually happens. To discover that the catastrophe, more often than not, doesn't arrive, and that when things are imperfect, they are survivable. Richard Heimberg at Temple University, whose group-based CBT program has been tested in multiple clinical trials throughout the 1990s and 2000s, contributed something particularly valuable. The insight that doing exposure in a group of people who share the experience carries its own power. Watching others face feared situations and survive, not as an abstraction, but in real time, in the same room, is a form of evidence that no amount of private reasoning can quite replicate. Acceptance and commitment therapy, developed by psychologist Stephen Hayes at the University of Nevada, offers a different but complementary pathway. Rather than primarily targeting the content of anxious thoughts, ACT focuses on changing the relationship with them. The core shift is from how do I make these thoughts go away to how do I stop letting these thoughts determine what I do. When a person can notice an anxious thought, they're going to find me boring, and observe it as a thought rather than a fact, something shifts. The thought loses some of its authority. Mindfulness-based approaches have also been studied in relation to social anxiety. Research by Philippe Golden and James Gross at Stanford University found that participants who completed an 8-week mindfulness-based stress reduction program showed both reduced social anxiety symptoms and measurable changes in brain activity, including reduced amygdala reactivity. The practice of non-judgmental, present-moment attention appears to work, at least in part, through the same neural circuitry that underlies social anxiety. Attending to the present gently loosens the anticipatory grip of a feared future. On the pharmacological side, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, SSRIs, are the first-line medication treatment for social anxiety disorder, with paroxetine, sertraline, and fluvoxamine, all carrying FDA approval for this indication. The evidence suggests that for moderate to severe presentations, the combination of medication and psychotherapy tends to produce the best outcomes. The medication reducing the intensity of anxiety enough to make engagement with exposure-based work more accessible, and the therapy addressing the cognitive and behavioral patterns that sustain the condition. One last thing worth naming: the role of self-compassion. Kristen Neff at the University of Texas has written and researched extensively on self-compassion as a psychological practice, the capacity to respond to one's own struggles with the same warmth and patience one might offer to a good friend. For someone whose social anxiety includes a dimension of harsh, constant self-criticism, and it often does, learning to respond to moments of social imperfection with gentleness rather than judgment is not merely a pleasant idea. It is, based on the research, a meaningful component of recovery. Here's the thing that the science, across all its methods and findings, keeps pointing toward, and it's the kind of thing that sounds obvious until you feel it. Social anxiety is not evidence that something is wrong with you. It is evidence that something is working. Specifically, a threat detection system calibrated over evolution and experience to take the social world seriously. Because the social world is serious. Belonging, acceptance, connection, these are not trivial. They are linked to survival in a genuinely ancient way. The amygdala that fires at a contemptuous look is the same amygdala that once registered. To be cast out from the group is to be alone in the dark. What has gone wrong in social anxiety is not the caring about connection. It is the calibration. The alarm is set too sensitive. The threats are miscategorized. The safety behaviors that prevent the catastrophe from ever being disproved. The post-event processing that writes the story of failure over and over. All of this is maintaining a system that originally made sense. And here, buried in the neuroscience and the cognitive models and the treatment literature, is perhaps the most quietly radical thing the science has to offer. The brain is not static. The amygdala's reactivity can be retrained. The prefrontal cortex's regulatory capacity can be strengthened. The associations between social situations and threat can be updated with new experience, new evidence, new information. Not overnight, not without effort, but genuinely, verifiably. For most people who engage with the work, the pattern can shift. The person with social anxiety, who rehearsed every conversation the night before, who gripped the glass to hide the trembling, who replayed every silence for evidence of failure, that person is not permanently broken. They are operating from a very old script, written in a very old language, by an alarm system doing its best. And that script can be rewritten. You've been so patient tonight, sitting with something tender and complicated and more universal than most of us realize. Whatever brought you here to listen to this, I hope something in it found you where you are. If tonight's exploration brought you some company in the quiet, please consider leaving a like or subscribing so you can find your way back whenever you need to. I'll be here, exploring gently, with you. Good night.